Hello, this is Dr. Pasion-Gonzales, and this week is Chapter 8 on development, and I have a special treat for you. I have Dr. Lori Pasion-Gonzales is actually going to do the video lecture today. All right, so without any further ado, Dr. Pasion-Gonzales.
Hello, I'm the female Dr. Pasion-Gonzales, and I'm here to talk with you today about developmental psychology, and that's Chapter 8 in your book. And the developmental theories focus on explaining how humans change and grow over the course from childhood into adulthood. And those theories are overlapping, but generally they explain social and emotional development and cognitive development, to some extent physical development, the development of morals, behavioral development, and even psychosexual development. And developmental theories overall try to answer questions such as, why do children behave in certain ways? Is their behavior related to their age, their family issues, relationships, individual temperaments? Developmental psychologists strive to answer questions as well as to understand, explain, and predict behaviors that occur throughout the lifespan. The idea that development occurs from childhood to adulthood, or lifespan development, was largely ignored throughout a lot of human history, actually. And before the advent of the study of development, largely children were just regarded as mini adults. And even thinking about a baby in the womb was conceived of, excuse the pun, as just a miniature person in the egg. And that view was called preformationism. And they believed that a homunculus, or miniature adult, was contained in the egg or the semen at conception. And then the homunculus was only quantitatively different from the adult. And largely after the beginning of modern science, the whole idea of preformationist thinking was kind of thrown out. I'm going to go backward a little bit just to give you a little history. This is not contained in your chapter, but I think it's kind of important to understand that the two early theorists that began to explain development, childhood development, were John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And one way, I guess the most important thing to know about John Locke, for instance, is he's considered the father of modern learning theory. And for him, he believed that the child was a tabula rasa, also known as just a blank slate, and that the experience writes on that blank slate, and that's what's responsible for the development of a child. So he really emphasized the role of the environment in development. Now, Rousseau is often identified as the father of classical developmental psychology. He wrote a book called Emile in 1762, and he championed the view that emphasized the natural unfolding of the child based on an innate blueprint. Very much the idea that that it's predetermined how a child develops, that it's a biological reality. And he was the first one to argue that development takes place in stages. In all of these theories, the researchers or theorists are always looking through the lens of nature versus nurture. How much of our development is kind of hardwired, a result of just biological advancement or evolution, and how much of it is determined by our environment or learning. There was a great deal of material to cover in this chapter, so the way that I decided to review it, and in some cases we'll even dive deeper, is we're just going to go through the lifespan and talk about each of the theories within the time frame that we're looking at. So here are the theorists who are covered in your chapter and what kind of development they cover. So Jean Piaget. His theory is cognitive development, and that just means the development of thinking and problem solving and memory and speech. And he developed a stage theory from infancy to adolescence or adulthood. And he said that human development is related to the acquisition of knowledge. And one thing important to know about Piaget is he studied his own children, and they were the basis for his little learning experiments. And he said that knowledge develops in stages, and these stages are sequential, and that intelligence is a biological adaptation. And then another name in your chapter is Lev Vygotsky. And he definitely focused on cognitive development as well, but he stressed the importance of cultural interactions with others. Erikson he's a theorist that explains psychosocial development, the development of personality and the role of relationships. And then under psychosocial development, also covered in your chapter, is temperament and attachment. And the names most commonly associated with that are Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby. There's also a Freudian view of development, which you'll have later. It's not included in this chapter, but I just wanted to mention it because it is really a theory of personality development, and it's known as the psychosexual theory. And it is a developmental theory, and you'll cover it later in some other chapters, but Freud has a lot to say about how he thinks children develop and how that unfolds. And for him, he has a sexual explanation for how personality unfolds and how things can get fixed, children can get fixed on one stage or another. So I'm going to start with birth today, but I cannot encourage you enough to take 20 minutes, go to YouTube, and watch one of Annie Murphy Paul's presentations on what we learn before we're born. Fascinating stuff. It won't take too much of your time, but I'm positive that you'll love it. So let's go into the life stages and what's going on. And the first stage we're going to cover is infancy or babyhood. So, and in each one of these stages, I'm going to go in the same order. We're going to talk about what's going on physically, then we'll talk about what's going on cognitively, then we'll talk about what's going on in terms of psychosocial, and then moral. So, in infancy, what's going on physically? So much, just a rapid period of development. The most important thing that's going on probably here are the innate reflexes, and they covered those in your book. There's the sucking reflex, the startle reflex, the grasping reflex, rooting, and even stepping. Then there's brain development, a lot of brain development going on, and then motor development. The motor milestones during infancy are raising the head and chest, rolling over, sitting up with support, and then sitting up without support, crawling, and then walking. At this time, the brain triples in weight from birth to age 3. Then there's the first stage of synaptic pruning. We're going to cover this later again in adolescence, but what that means is this is the first time in the baby's life that this is going on in the brain, and there's actually a loss of neurons because they're unused synaptic connections, and nerve cells are cleared away, making room for more growth. And that's in anticipation of moving away from reflexes and more into learning. And by 1, the average baby has tripled her birth weight and grown about a foot. Cognitively, what's going on here between 0 and 2 is Piaget's stage of sensory motor. And the important thing to understand here is very simple. Children are exploring their world through the senses and through movement. And they acquire knowledge through sensory observation, seeing, touching, hearing, tasting, and exploring their environment. They're beginning to master their own motor functioning through exploration and being active and by directly manipulating their environment. So picking things up, grasping, tasting, all of that kind of stuff. The infant gains a sense of achievement through mastery. For instance, going from being able to just lie on your belly to sitting up, that's a sense of mastery, and they learn through this mastery. And 2 important achievements during this period. One is called object permanence, and the whole idea is simply that an object still exists even when I can't see it. You can imagine how this is so important to a baby, right? Just because mom or dad leaves the room doesn't mean they've disappeared. Learning that a person continues to exist, an object continues to exist, is critical for the baby's learning. The second thing that they begin to learn is what Piaget calls schemas. And it's just a mental concept or a framework that guides organization and interpretation of information. It's a precursor to language. You have to have a schema in your mind, according to Piaget, before you can actually learn the language for it. So using my current schema to try to interpret something new is called assimilation, and altering my own schema to fit new information is called accommodation. As far as moral development, which is the theory by Lawrence Kohlberg, officially this is part of the pre-conventional stage of morality. Not a lot of moral development going on with the infant. But psychosocial development, the theory that's represented by Erik Erikson, this is the first psychosocial stage of development known as trust versus mistrust. In every one of Erik Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development, there's a critical crisis that has to be resolved, and then there's a virtue that emerges. So in the infant stage, they have to develop trust that their wants and needs will be satisfied by their parents or caregivers. And if the baby's need for comfort, food, and affection is met, then they develop a sense of trust. And they trust people, and they come to expect that their needs will be met in the future. So it's very important for future relationship building that babies successfully go through this. And of course, it probably goes without saying, but if those are not successfully met, then the child develops a sense of mistrust, not only in people, but in their environment. Another psychosocial idea that's very important and is relevant during infancy is just the idea that children have their own innate temperaments. So they come out of the womb with a basic temperament, and typically those are just divided into, the easy baby, difficult, or slow to warm. And another way of watching what's happening psychosocially for the infant is looking at the caregiver-child bond or relationship. And the emotional bond that's developed in infancy with the caregiver, the mom or dad, is known as attachment. And the names associated with attachment, which I told you earlier, are Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby. And the idea here is that the quality of the emotional bond that forms between baby and mother or caregiver sets the stage for not only the rest of the relationship in the future, but all future relationships. So not just the relationship for the baby and the parent, but it is the blueprint for relationships that will follow, especially personal ones, romantic ones. You read about the strange situation studies by Mary Ainsworth. And she examined the nature of the baby's attachment style and articulated 4 different styles. One was secure, the other was avoidant, the other was ambivalent, and the last one is disorganized or disoriented. And you probably remember the gist of the study, but mom and baby are in a room together, and then a stranger enters. And the researchers watch how the baby responds to this. Then they might have the mother leave, and or they might have the stranger leave and then come back. And this is actually not only important, but I think just incredibly interesting stuff. What the researchers are looking most closely at is how the child behaves with and toward the mother when she returns. So they speculate that that tells the story of their emotional bond. Okay, let's move on to toddlerhood, and this is the age between 1 and 3, roughly. So physically, what's going on? There's increased mobility, gross motor and fine motor development. That means gross means the larger muscles, and fine means the smaller muscles. Those are developing. And now, instead of walking with hands high, for instance, they're moving fairly proficiently and with greater agility and coordination. There's much more muscle strength and greater control over their bodies, and a rapid advancement of language skills. So cognitively what's going on, and that of course has to do with the development of language skills also. This is the period that Piaget calls the pre-operational period. This is the beginning of the pre-operational period. And roughly that's from ages 2 to 7. We're just covering toddlerhood right now. But during this stage, which goes well beyond the toddler period, the child begins learning to use language to explore the world. So during this time, there are several things to be aware of that characterize the limitations of the child at this point. First of all, there's something called egocentrism, and that's the inability to see the world through someone else's eyes. The child is very egocentric. Everything is about him or herself. The world begins and ends right here. So they believe that they're responsible for everything that occurs in their universe. And to me, this is really interesting because toddlerhood is when kids become very resistant, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of their psychosocial development. But they're learning a greater sense of autonomy, and they're much more likely to say no and so forth. But remember, they're very egocentric. They don't really know or care. They can't imagine how other people feel. But very often you hear toddlers being disciplined with things like, how do you think Mary feels when you do that? And if the caregiver only understood that the toddler's going, I have no idea what Mary thinks. Another important area that happens here is conservation. In other words, there is no conservation yet. They can't conserve because of something called centration. Centration is the tendency to only focus on one feature of an object, and they ignore other relevant features. So conservation requires that I understand that changing the appearance of an object doesn't change the nature of the object. So I have a little example. I'm not sure what example the book might have provided, but I want you to see the idea of centration and lack of conservation in action. So this is a classic experiment that Piaget did with his own children to demonstrate that in the pre-operational stage, they did not have conservation yet and were dependent on centration. So he would show these 2 glasses of liquid and ask the child, do these have the same amount? And because of centration, paying attention to just one aspect of an object at a time, they would say yes, because they can see that the level of milk in each glass is exactly the same. So then he would take the glass, because they agreed they were equal, he would take the glass, the same liquid is then poured into a taller glass, and then he would say, now, do they have the same amount? And the child would say, no, this one has more. And again, because of centration, only being able to focus on one aspect of the object at a time, they conclude that this has more milk in it because it's taller. It's higher now than it was before. They're not able to conserve, meaning keep the idea that an object remains the same even if you alter its state somewhat. And they now believed that this was more. Even if he pours it back into the original glass and shows them, see, it's the same amount, now they'll conclude that they both have the same amount, but again, only because I see it. If I pour it back into here, they'll conclude that this one now has more. And that's the classic experiment for pre-operational stage. Also during this period, children begin to use symbols and language more and more, and so children can just begin to write or draw during toddlerhood. Also, psychosocial development. This is the stage of autonomy versus shame and doubt, ages 1 through 3. And when toddlers learn that they have control over their own actions, they develop some independence, right? So when they're prohibited from being independent, they develop a sense of self-doubt. And the central question during this time period is, can I do things myself? Can I be independent? Or do I have to rely on others? And the virtue that develops out of this stage when it's mastered successfully is will, the idea of will. And some important tasks during this stage are the child being able to dress him or herself, picking out my own clothes, making food choices, and deciding what I like, choosing which toys I want to play with, and even toilet training. Now, before we go on to preschool, I want to go and talk a little bit about Vygotsky. He's the one that stressed the importance of, that's Lev Vygotsky. He stressed the importance of social and cultural interactions with others, with other people, and typically more highly skilled children or authoritative adults. And the way that works is that others ask children leading questions and they provide examples of things. So he said that culture is a primary determinant of knowledge acquisition, and children learn by beliefs and attitudes modeled in their culture. He also said that language is the basis of learning, which is just the opposite of what Piaget asserts, right? And he said culture is significant in learning and language is the root of culture. So individuals learn and develop within their role in the community. And a couple of his important contributions. He's the one that talked about the zone of proximal development, and that's just the difference between what a child can achieve or demonstrate on their own and what they can learn or do with the help of another. So the difference between those two is called the zone of proximal development. And he also developed the idea of scaffolding. And that is simply that when a more experienced person gives more assistance as the child is learning and then starts to take away or withdraw that help as the learner skill develops. All right, let's move on to preschool, the ages between 3 and 5. So physically, what's happening, by 3, all the baby teeth are in. Children can climb stairs 1 foot at a time. Before this, you're seeing children climb stairs with the right foot, and then the right foot again, and then the right foot, and then, or left, but 1 foot leads each time. Now they're able to serially go up the stairs 1 foot at a time. They have improved fine and gross motor skills. They can throw a ball overhand with some skill. They can hop on 1 foot. Running is much easier. They love to climb typically. They can feed themselves with a spoon and a fork. They can hold a pencil and begin to write letters. They can run backwards. They can skip. They can easily catch a ball or balance on 1 foot. And by this time, they typically have developed hand dominance. Cognitively, children are still in the pre-operational stage, according to Piaget, the one that we just covered and talked about. They're still very egocentric, believing that they're responsible for the things that happen in their universe. Morally, according to Kohlberg, they're in the pre-conventional stage of morality, and this goes from 3 to 10. The motivation for any moral behavior is just to avoid punishment or to gain reward during the pre-conventional period. So rules are fixed and absolute. You obey rules, though, to avoid punishment, not necessarily because you have some sense of rightness, or you follow the rules in front of authority figures because you might gain some kind of reward. That's really the motivation. That's the basis for morality at this stage. But your own conduct really depends on someone being around to see your actions and to reward or punish them. So children will do what they're expected to do in front of the authority figure, pretty much just based on, will I get in trouble and is there some reward for me if I do the right thing? In terms of psychosocial development, this is Erikson's stage of initiative versus guilt. Children begin to assert their power and control over the world. They're self-directing their play and their social interactions. The conflict here is initiative versus guilt. And the major question that a child is answering during this period is, am I good or bad? And the basic virtue that comes out of this dilemma is purpose. And the important events that happen during this stage are all based on exploration and play. If they've successfully completed the earlier two stages, kids now have a sense that the world is trustworthy and that they're able to act independently. So now it's important for kids to learn that they can exert power over themselves and the world. They need to try things on their own and explore their own abilities. And by doing this, they can develop ambition and direction. And if they're thwarted by when they take their own initiative, then they develop guilt and begin to question, am I bad? All right, let's move on to school age. This is roughly the ages between 6 and 11. Physically, there's considerable variation in growth and development between this period. You see a lot of differences in height and weight. There's just a lot of variation in physical development. So most girls are experiencing a pre-adolescent growth spurt around 9 or 10, and most boys experience the same growth spurt more around 11 or 12. Gross and fine motor skills continue to refine. More complex behavioral and cognitive abilities become possible as the central nervous system is maturing. And by the beginning of middle childhood, children typically have acquired a leaner, more athletic appearance. Girls and boys still have similar body shapes and proportions until both sexes reach puberty. Now, puberty can begin in this time period, but it's much more likely to happen a little bit later. And that's just the process whereby children sexually mature into teenagers and adults. And early in middle childhood, a growth spurt occurs in the brain so that by 8 or 9, the organ is nearly adult size. The brain is nearly adult size. And brain development during middle childhood is characterized by growth of specific structures, and especially the frontal lobe. Now, this lobe is located on the front of the brain, just under the skull, and it's responsible for planning, reasoning, social judgment, ethical decision-making, among other functions. So cognitively, you can see that the physical development informs the cognitive development. So this is the stage that Piaget calls concrete operational. So children are moving out of egocentricity, out of just self-focus and believing that I'm the center of everything, and into operational thought, so they can now begin to see things from another person's perspective. That's really pretty critical. And this is the period of development of logical thought. So kids at this age become more logical about concrete and specific things that they can actually experience, but they're still going to struggle with abstract ideas, hypothetical ideas. So a child has much greater capacity for logical reasoning, but only when they're thinking about reality that they've actually had. They're coming to understand hierarchical relationships, and now they can understand reversibility. Reversibility is the idea that I showed you in the conservation experiment, the idea that when I pour the milk from the larger glass back to the original glass, everything stays the same. You can reverse a process and still understand that the original object remains the same. If you were to, in the earlier stage, pre-operational stage, if you were to break one piece of 3-inch chalk, if you were to break it up in, say, 3 or 4 pieces and spread it out, the child might conclude that that's now longer. But once they get the notion of reversibility, they understand that that piece of chalk is the same, even if it's broken into several different pieces. They're able to conserve. They have the idea of reversibility. Okay, another important thing that can happen around this time is the child can begin to go from a specific example to a general principle, which is part of the formation of logic. So here's an example. Let's say that every time I'm around a cat, I start to have itchy eyes and a runny nose and a swollen throat. And then I can conclude at this stage that maybe I'm allergic to cats. So I can go from a specific example of these things happening when I'm around a cat to a general idea or principle, hey, I think I'm allergic to a cat. Morally, they're still largely in the pre-conventional stage where I act morally because of fear of punishment or with the anticipation of reward. But they might be beginning to move into a more conventional stage of morality. And that means that they're now able to see maybe that an action is morally right if it conforms to the rules of society. So early in the stage, a child is most concerned about being seen as good by others. They care about the approval of others. Psychosocially. So in Erikson's stage, this is the stage of industry versus inferiority. The central question here is, how can I be good? And kids are capable of performing increasingly complex tasks, so they strive to master new skills. And children who are encouraged and commended by others develop a feeling of competence and a belief in themselves and their abilities. And kids who fail to develop this sense of themselves can end up feeling inferior. And the basic virtue that comes out of this is competence. So when I'm encouraged and commended on the things that I do, I develop a sense of competence. Let me give you just an example. Let's say there are two fourth graders, which would put them in this stage of development, Jack and Olivia. And both of them struggle with fourth grade science. But when Olivia goes home, her parents are willing to work on her homework with her, and she's willing to ask the teacher for help. And so as a result of this, she actually gets the help she needs. She learns to be more proficient. And she begins to get messages from her parents and maybe even from her teacher that she's making gains, she's learning, she's praised for her initiative in coming to ask for help. And so she gains a sense of competence, whereas let's say Jack, who's struggling with the same science curriculum, comes home, but his parents aren't really interested in helping him with his homework, and he doesn't ask the teacher for any help because he's very shy or whatever, and he continues to get poor grades, and there isn't the availability of either help or positive feedback about his performance, and so he ends up feeling inferior. Okay, moving on to adolescence. This, for our purposes, is going to incorporate 12 to 21. Physically, what's going on is puberty. There's developing sexuality they're developing sexually in their primary sex characteristics, so the growth of the sex glands, and then in secondary sex characteristics like body hair and the development of breasts. There's often a change in voice, an increase in height, often in weight, and when the body changes stop, the brain growth continues. So well into the 20s, brain growth is continuing. Typically at this age, teenagers or adolescents need about 9 to 10 hours of sleep. This is the second stage of synaptic pruning. Remember, we talked about that in infancy. This is the second time it happens. So what that means, again, is any connections in the brain that aren't being used may be pruned, whereas connections in the brain that are used frequently are becoming more efficient. So what that means is that two things that are important here. One, it means that the adolescent brain is kind of unstable and changing. And the other thing is that it's really important that parents pay attention to how the adolescent is spending time. Because again, what connections or roads they're using with some regularity, those are being reinforced. The most used connections will survive the pruning process. So it's really important during that time what gets practiced. Also, adolescent behavior is the result of at least two important processes: the increase in hormones and a brain that's not yet developed the controls it needs for mature judgment. So that frontal lobe development that we talked about in the last stage, still developing, not fully developed yet. Cognitively, this is the stage of formal operations for Piaget. So it begins roughly at 12 and continues and lasts into adulthood. And this is the ability to think much more abstractly and theoretically. And this is the time when deductive logic is developed. So the idea that you can use a general principle to determine a particular outcome. So the classic example used is Earth is a planet. All planets revolve around the sun. Therefore, the Earth revolves around the sun. That is deductive logic. At this age, they can systematically solve problems, they can be logical, and they can be methodical. Morally, they're entering the conventional stage of moral development, but maybe in the second half of this stage, which is a more of a concern for maintaining the social order. So the individual becomes aware of the wider rules of society, so judgments concern obeying rule in order to uphold law and to avoid guilt. Psychosocially, the central conflict during this stage is identity versus role diffusion. So the major question that the adolescent is asking is, who am I? And the virtue that emerges from this stage is fidelity, the ability to relate to others in the form of genuine relationships. The most important events in this stage are social relationships. That's why teens are so focused in on those. Hopefully, they come out of this stage with a strong identity and a developing sense of a direction in life. And as your book pointed out, the adolescent is still very egocentric in some ways. Not in the Piagetian way of the inability to take the role of another, they can do that, but in the sense that they're very preoccupied with themselves. There's a lot of introspection. They're preoccupied with their own thoughts and their own ideas about themselves. And the two ways that shows itself are in the personal fable, and that's just the idea that I'm very special and unique and people don't understand what I'm going through. And then something called the imaginary audience, which is just the extreme self-consciousness and the idea that everyone's looking at me or paying attention to what I'm doing. Moving right along to young adulthood. Physically, what's happening is physical growth is complete. Peak bone mass, and mostly people are at their peak physically and sexually at this age. However, at about your mid-30s, you'll begin to slow and you'll notice some signs of aging. There's a decline in the immune system, a decline in response time, and the ability to recover quickly from physical exertion. Welcome to adulthood. Cognitively, this is a time of formal operations. In this stage, psychosocially, their adults are beginning to achieve autonomy and establishing a firm identity. And now maybe the identity is in terms of career and family and developing emotional stability, finding intimacy, becoming part of a group or a community, establishing a residence and learning how to manage a household, and becoming a spouse and a parent. So this is the stage that Erickson calls intimacy versus isolation. The major question is, will I be loved or will I be alone? And the virtue we develop through the completion of this stage is love. The important events here that are happening around this time are romantic relationships. Morally, this is the time of post-conventional moral development, according to Kohlberg. There's an understanding of universal ethical principles like the importance of human dignity or preservation of life at all costs. Most people only get to the first level of this post-conventional moral development, according to Kohlberg, and that's where individual judgment is based on self-chosen principles, and moral reasoning is based on individual rights and justice. The individual or the child becomes aware that while rules and laws might exist for the good of the greatest number, there are times when they will work against the interest of particular individuals. In this stage, there's some ability to understand that the issues are not always clear-cut. Now, in stage 6, so this is the latter half of the third stage of moral development, sometimes known as stage 6 or the universal principles. People at this stage, and remember, Kohlberg doesn't believe that everybody achieves this stage. As a matter of fact, I think he only believes 10 or 15% of the people actually get to this stage. They've developed their own set of moral guidelines, which may or may not fit the law. The principles apply to everyone, and they're self-chosen. So, for instance, human rights, justice, and equality. The person will be prepared to act to defend these principles, even if it means going against the rest of society. In the process of having to pay the consequences of disapproval or imprisonment. But that's stage 6, where people are willing to create their own set of ethics or morals, even if they don't fit the convention of the rest of the larger society. All right, we're going to move on to middle age, and this covers the period of 40 to 65. Physically, hearing and vision changes. There's typically weight gain, not really because people are eating more, but because their metabolism has slowed and they're probably eating about the same. Typically, there's some muscle loss, there's a lowered metabolism. Menopause typically occurs for women, and something that you learned about called andropause for men. So for men, there's lower levels of testosterone and less sperm production. They're still fertile, they can still reproduce, whereas menopause is the end of reproduction for women. And there's also some loss of height starting in this stage of development. Cognitively, so contrary to its reputation as a slower, duller version of a youthful brain, in this time of development, it seems that the middle-aged brain not only maintains many of the abilities of youth, but it actually acquires some new ones. The adult brain seems to be capable of rewiring itself well into middle age. So there's still plasticity, they're still learning and growing, and they're incorporating decades of experiences and behaviors. And research suggests, for example, that the middle-aged brain is calmer, less neurotic, and better able to sort through social situations. Some middle-agers even have improved cognitive abilities. Processing speed may decrease, and there's some normal age-related cognitive decline, largely affecting memory. Psychosocially, this is the time where the central conflict is generativity versus stagnation, and the virtue that develops is one of care. So the major question here is, how can I contribute? This is the time in your life when you're more focused on not just your career, but what contributions you're making to larger society. So during this time, the important events are parenthood and work. That's typically the way we're most contributing to society. And during this time, adults strive to create or nurture things that will outlast them, often by parenting children or contributing to positive changes that benefit other people. And contributing to society and doing things to benefit the future generations are important needs that help us to feel like we're generative versus just stagnating. Okay. Let's talk about later adulthood, sometimes known as old age, and that's 65 plus. So physically, for the most part, physical activities often tend to decline due to in these years, due to years of being sedentary, or sometimes as a result of disease processes like arthritis or other chronic diseases. But overall, people who are more active tend to be happier and healthier. And developmentalists often divide this age category into two separate. One they call the young old, who are healthy and active, and then the old who have health problems and maybe have some difficulty with their daily living activities. And aging successfully involves making adjustments as needed in order to continue living as independently and actively as possible. And that's referred to as selective optimization with compensation. And what that means is it's a strategy for improving health and well-being in older adults and a model for successful aging. And it's just recommended that seniors select and optimize their best abilities and most intact functions while just compensating for their declines and losses. So this means, for example, that a person who can no longer drive is able to find alternative transportation, or a person who's compensating for having less energy learns how to reorganize the daily routine to avoid overexertion. So it's not seen as having to give up things, but to accommodate the aging process and learn to meet your needs differently. Psychosocially, this is the stage of integrity versus despair. This is the 8th stage, the last stage that Erickson believes goes on until death. And the central conflict here is, am I going to have a sense of integrity, or will I despair? And the basic virtue that develops in this stage is what you might imagine, wisdom. The central question here is, did I live a meaningful life? And the important events are looking back over the years that you've already lived and evaluating your life. And what that also may mean for some of us is not just evaluating, but maybe making some decisions based on what's left of my life to regroup and maybe do things a little bit differently with the time that I have left, maybe making up for lost time. But generally speaking, this is often the time of looking back and deciding whether my life had meaning, whether I contributed anything. And that's it. That's lifespan development.
All right. Honey, thank you. Appreciate it.
It's not honey. It's Dr. Pasion-Gonzales.
Dr. PG, thank you. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Read your book. Do all of the quizzes, the Revel quizzes scattered throughout the chapter. Remember to take both the Revel chapter exam, the Revel chapter quiz, and separate from that is the Canvas exam. Remember that they're two different things. You have a discussion board this week. Watch that. And my office hours are Tuesday nights, 7 o'clock. If you have any questions, reach out to me, okay?
Remember to do your work, not because you'll get in trouble if you don't, but because it's the right thing to do.
Exactly right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.